Did you know that a young queen with a single decision transformed the fate of an entire people, facing the most imposing threat of her time? In the midst of an empire full of power, intrigue, and danger, Esther emerged as a beacon of bravery, willing to risk everything to save her people. But her story is not simply a fight for survival, it is a profound testimony of faith, courage, and divine purpose. If you dare to discover how, armed only with her faith and intelligence, this woman overcame the darkness of her time, join me until the end. Remember to subscribe and share this video, because what you are about to hear may completely change your view of what is possible. Imagine, then, the vast and mysterious territories of the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC, a land of splendor where marble palaces gleamed under the sun and caravans laden with spices, silks, and exotic wealth traveled ancient trade routes. In this grand setting, King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, ruled with an iron hand and boundless ambition, extending his empire from distant India to the borders of Ethiopia, subjecting hundreds of provinces to his will. The capital, Susa, thrummed with life, exquisite gardens, majestic temples, and avenues adorned with statues of Persian gods shaped a vibrant center of activity, where the luxurious palace halls were both witnesses to lavish celebrations and subtle intrigues that could change the fate of entire nations. And yet, in the humblest corners of the city, the shadows of everyday life were woven. In the heart of Susa lived Esther, a young woman whose existence was marked by resilience and strength. Born into a Jewish family, tragedy struck early when she lost her parents, leaving her orphaned and vulnerable amidst the adversities faced by her people in foreign lands. But fate had a ray of hope in store for her. Her cousin Mordecai, a wise and deeply faithful man, took her in as a daughter and guided her with unshakable love. Despite living in an empire that often disregarded Jewish identity, Mordecai was never ashamed of his roots, teaching Esther the immense value of her heritage and the importance of keeping her faith alive in a world that, at times, seemed to forget God's presence. The environment around Esther was imposing and, at times, even terrifying. Persian customs, so foreign to Jewish tradition, marked every aspect of life, especially when it came to the behavior of women in high society. King Ahasuerus' law was unappealable, and his decisions could alter the lives of millions. In the palaces, adorned with intricate mosaics and silk tapestries, dazzling feasts were held, but acts of violence and betrayal also took root in the silent corridors of power. It was a time of contrasts, where the fate of a single person could change with the slightest royal gesture. Although Esther was raised amidst luxury and privilege, she never lost her humility or essence. The young woman, aware that her life, though filled with blessings thanks to Mordecai's care, was unique, never imagined the events that were about to unfold and completely transform her fate and that of her people. Over time, her beauty stood out among the young women of Susa, but it was her character, intelligence, and integrity that made her truly special. Unknowingly, she was destined to be the pivot of a story that would forever change the course of Israel and Persia. Life in Susa went on, and although Esther could not foresee what the future held, invisible forces were guiding her toward a destiny that exceeded any expectation. As rumors about King Ahasuerus' growing ambition spread through markets and squares, for Esther and Mordecai, the daily routine was a reminder that life must go on. However, dramatic and unexpected changes were on the horizon. The splendor of the Persian Empire was not limited to its palaces, but also manifested in the opulence of its royal banquets. During Ahasuerus' reign, these feasts were held regularly, symbolizing the greatness of Persia. It was at one of these banquets, as grand as it was unforgettable, where the spark was ignited that would mark an irreversible turn in Esther's life. It was the third year of Ahasuerus' reign, a time of splendor and greatness in the Persian Empire. The king, eager to impress his court and leave a mark of magnificence on history, organized a monumental banquet in the citadel of Susa. For 180 days, the celebration went on without interruption, lavishly displaying riches, wines, and everything Persia could offer. Every detail was carefully planned, from the courtesy at the table to the strict etiquette rules that governed the celebration. But Ahasuerus was not satisfied with just the admiration of his subjects. He wanted more. He wanted his queen, Vashti, to display her beauty before the nobles and highest officials of his kingdom. However, Queen Vashti, known both for her magnificent beauty and her strong character, refused to comply with her husband's order. When the king asked her to appear before his court to showcase her splendor, Vashti decided not to do so. Her refusal not only surprised Ahasuerus, but also stunned everyone present, who expected to see in her the very reflection of royalty at its peak. In the Persian court, disobedience of such magnitude was not just an act of rebellion, it was a challenge to the king's honor. This insult, though personal, affected the dignity of the monarch, and he, humiliated, was forced to make a decision that would change the course of events. With the counsel of his princes and wise men, Ahasuerus issued a decree that removed Vashti from her throne. Although the reason for the removal was made public, the true story remained hidden in the shadows of the palace, where political and personal interests were quietly intertwined. What initially seemed like a tragedy for Vashti became an opportunity for many other young women, an opportunity that would change the fate of many, including Esther. In his loneliness after the loss of his queen, Ahasuerus decided that he must choose a new wife. But this would not be just any selection. The process would be a competition involving the most beautiful young women from the provinces of the empire. This was not just an opportunity to change the lives of these women, it was a unique chance to transform their destiny. It was then that Mordecai, Esther's cousin and protector, decided that she should participate. Although Esther was young and simple, her beauty and character made her stand out among the rest. Esther, though full of faith and respect for her people, felt insecure about what was being asked of her. Her life until that moment, marked by Mordecai's protection and wisdom, would never be the same. The young Jewish woman found herself caught between her duty to her cousin and her people, and the uncertainty of what being part of the king's court would entail. The preparation for this journey was rigorous. Like many other young women from the city, Esther underwent a series of physical and etiquette tests. For months, she was treated with oils, perfumes, and fine cosmetics to enhance her outer beauty. But the transformation was not only external, Esther also had to undergo an internal metamorphosis. The court's rules were strict. She had to behave with elegance, learn Persian rituals, and most importantly, keep her identity a secret. She must never reveal that she was Jewish. As Esther prepared for this radical change in her life, her heart was filled with questions and doubts. How would she present herself to the king? How could she stay true to her faith without revealing her origin? Would her beauty be enough to win Ahasuerus' heart? And most crucially, how could she fulfill the destiny Mordecai saw for her without losing her essence? During this time of preparation, Esther immersed herself in prayer, seeking strength and direction. Although the Persian kingdom was full of gods foreign to the God of Israel, Esther never let go of her faith. Since childhood, Mordecai had taught her to trust in divine purpose, and now, more than ever, she needed that faith to face what was to come. With each passing day, the weight of uncertainty grew, but so did the drive to fulfill a destiny that even she did not fully understand. The long-awaited day arrived. Esther, in her gala dress, her serene face, and a mix of nervousness and determination in her chest, was escorted to the palace. The hall, adorned with gold and marble, was filled with young women competing for the king's favor. However, something in Esther was different. Her calm, her modesty, and the light that seemed to emanate from her did not go unnoticed. King Ahasuerus, who had met many beautiful women, looked at her with a surprise that went beyond physical admiration. Esther stood out not only for her external beauty, but for something much deeper. She had arrived at the palace as a simple young woman, but within her, she already carried a divine purpose that would make her much more, the woman who would change the fate of her people. Her path to the throne would not be easy, but Esther was willing to face it with faith and courage, even though she would never know for certain what the future held for her. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the palace, Mordecai watched with a mix of concern and hope. He knew that Esther's fate, and that of her people, was about to intertwine with the decisions of a king whose will was law. But Ahasuerus also faced his own challenges. And in this environment of opulence and mystery, the fate of many young women was about to change. The royal arena of Susa, where young women were recruited to compete for the throne, was not a place of freedom, but a space of strict observance of Persian rules. Every woman there knew that her fate was in the hands of the king, who would decide who would be his queen. For Esther, this process was not simply a matter of beauty or attraction, it was a matter of destiny, faith, and courage. Days after being selected, her preparation began with a meticulous series of rituals and training. While other young women went through the same process, Esther devoted herself not only to physical transformation, but also to inner transformation. As she was prepared with oils, perfumes, and cosmetics, she also had to perfect her manners and social skills under the strict supervision of the palace attendants. More than just an external change, her behavior had to be impeccable, calculated, and flawless. The days in the arena passed slowly, but Esther, with Mordecai's invisible support, never lost her essence. Although the court was a place filled with luxury and temptations, she did not allow herself to be consumed by vanity or palace intrigues. Her heart remained faithful to her Jewish roots, knowing that her mission was greater than she could comprehend at that moment. The weight of her destiny was in plain sight, but Esther walked with firm steps, never losing sight of her purpose. Finally, the day came. Esther presented herself before King Ahasuerus, who, surrounded by his nobles and counselors, awaited the next young woman from the arena. But when Esther entered the room, something changed in the air. It was not just her physical beauty that captivated the king, but something much deeper. Her presence radiated serenity, dignity, and a rare class among those young women who had gone through the same process. Her eyes reflected an inner calm, a silent strength that disarmed anyone who looked at her. Ahasuerus, known for his whims and power, could not help but be captivated. However, Esther did not rely solely on her appearance. She had been raised by Mordecai to be cautious, respectful, and discreet. She bowed before the king, showing deep respect for his position, but without losing her own value. The king observed her during what seemed like a long pause. Something in Esther had captivated him immediately, not just her beauty, but the way her humility blended with a quiet confidence. Without him saying a word, Esther understood that she must wait for the king to speak first. And so she did. Finally, Ahasuerus broke the silence and said, "What is it, Esther? What is your request? Whatever you ask, it will be given to you, even up to half of my kingdom." The offer was tempting, but Esther did not ask for riches or power. Instead, she bowed again, grateful, and humbly requested a banquet, one to which only the king and his top official, Haman, would be invited. Although her request might seem modest in the eyes of others, to Ahasuerus, it was something very significant. His interest in Esther grew even more, for he saw in her a woman who, though not asking for immediate power or wealth, knew how to capture his attention in a unique way. Esther did not give in to vanity. She maintained a mystery and balance between her beauty and her discretion, qualities that made her even more fascinating. Ahasuerus, who had already had many women in his life, could not help but feel drawn to Esther in a way he could not fully understand. There was something about her that transcended her exterior beauty, something that touched the deepest part of his being. The next day, the banquet Esther had meticulously prepared with the help of her servants was held. The atmosphere she had created was elegant, sober, yet with a strength and power that did not go unnoticed. The two most important men in the court, King Ahasuerus and Haman, arrived at the feast surprised by the atmosphere Esther had cultivated, a place where respect and simplicity met, wrapping everything in a captivating mystery. As food and wine flowed, Esther maintained an atmosphere of respect that enveloped the guests, never allowing the magic of her presence to dissipate. During the conversation, which revolved around the matters of the court, Esther found the right moment to speak. But as in her initial meeting with the king, she chose to wait. Her patience became her ally once again. When Ahasuerus, intrigued, asked her again to request whatever she wished, Esther, with a wisdom that only someone with a divine purpose could possess, requested another banquet for the following day. The king unknowingly agreed gladly, completely captivated by her behavior. The offer of a simple banquet actually hid a much larger plan that Esther had not even begun to imagine. The combination of mystery, respect, and discretion had managed to captivate the king in a unique way. Shortly after this meeting, Esther was officially crowned as the new queen of Persia. But this change in status not only represented an ascent in the court, but a radical transformation in her life. From being a young orphan under the care of her cousin Mordecai, Esther became the most powerful woman in the vast Persian Empire. Although her heart remained divided between her faith and the weight of her new role, Ahasuerus treated her with a respect that only a king could give to his queen. The love between them was still in its early stages, but there was a solid foundation of mutual respect that was beginning to grow stronger. However, Esther knew that her destiny was not sealed. As her position in the court rose, so did the danger that loomed over her people. The Persian court, wrapped in splendor, was marked by intrigues and secret ambitions. Amid this labyrinth of power and manipulation, there was a man who stood out with disproportionate influence and power: Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. His rise in the court was no accident, but the result of his political cunning, insatiable ambition, and a thirst for revenge that drove him. As a high official and the king's chief advisor, Haman not only enjoyed wealth and privileges, but his influence extended throughout the empire. No one doubted his ability to manipulate the king's decisions in his favor. However, behind his success, there was a deep disturbance that dominated him, an uncontrollable fury towards Mordecai, Queen Esther's cousin. This animosity did not begin with a simple disagreement, but with an act of disobedience that Haman could never forgive. Like everyone in the Persian court, Mordecai was required to bow to Haman whenever he passed through the royal squares. But Mordecai, faithful to his principles and his Jewish faith, refused to bow before him. For Mordecai, only God deserved worship, and bowing to a man was not something he was willing to do. This act of disobedience, seen by many as a display of bravery and fidelity to God, was perceived by Haman as a personal humiliation. Every time he saw Mordecai, rage grew in his heart. What began as a simple defiance turned into an obsession for revenge. Haman's hatred towards Mordecai intensified further when he discovered that he was a Jew, the same people who had historically been enemies of the Amalekites. Haman's lineage. And so, in the depths of his heart, Haman's fury grew, fueled by the belief that Mordecai and his people must be eliminated. The ancestral rivalry between the Amalekites and the Jews, sown in past generations, ignited an uncontrollable rage in Haman's heart. His desire was not only to destroy Mordecai, but to exterminate the entire Jewish people, believing that in doing so, he could avenge a historical affront that had plagued his family for centuries. In his mind, the solution was clear. If he could eliminate the Jews, he would not only annihilate Mordecai, but eradicate a threat that had haunted his lineage for generations. Driven by his growing power and ambition, Haman began to hatch a dark plan whose evil knew no limits. With his cunning and manipulation, Haman gained the trust of King Ahasuerus, who was unaware of his advisor's true intentions. Taking advantage of this trust, Haman presented his proposal in a private council, sowing doubt in the king's mind. "There is a people scattered and divided in all the provinces of your kingdom," he said, referring to the Jews, who behave differently from all other peoples. "Their laws are different, and they do not obey the king's commands. They even refuse to bow to your officials." Using his influence, Haman painted the Jews as a threat, a rebellious group that could jeopardize the stability of the empire. The king, trusting his advisor's wisdom, approved the proposal without hesitation, without further investigation. He granted him the power to take drastic measures. Haman, with a satisfied smile, drafted the decree that would order the annihilation of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. The decree, signed by the king, stated that on a certain day, all Jews, from the youngest to the oldest, would be exterminated, regardless of their status. The order would bring death and terror to every Jewish community. When the edict was sealed and sent, the shadow of horror quickly spread throughout the empire. In every city, the Jews began to receive the news, and panic gripped their hearts. The sentence was clear. They were to be annihilated. The land that had been their home for generations was now marked for destruction. When Mordecai, upon hearing of the edict, realized the magnitude of what was happening, he knew he had to act. With a heart full of anguish, he dressed in mourning clothes and headed toward the palace gates, where his despair was evident. God's people were on the brink of annihilation, and though he feared for his life, he knew he had to do something. The story of his people and of his niece Esther now depended on decisions that were beyond his control. From inside the palace, Esther watched Mordecai. She too had received the news of the decree, and her soul was moved. Although she was queen, she knew her life was also in danger. As being Jewish, she was part of the people condemned to die. But fear did not paralyze her. Instead, love and loyalty toward her people and toward Mordecai drove her to make a crucial decision. Haman had managed to sow chaos, division, and death. But what he didn't know was that his own actions would unleash a series of events that would change the fate of everyone, including his own. The day the decree of extermination arrived in Susa, the lives of the Jews in the Persian Empire took an irreversible turn. The news spread like a dark shadow that enveloped the city with despair. When Mordecai read the words of the decree sealed by King Ahasuerus, his world seemed to crumble. Each word resonated in his mind as a death sentence for his people. Fear invaded his being, but what tormented him the most was not his own life, but that of the thousands of Jews who, like him, were trapped in a system that saw them as a threat. The condemnation did not only fall on him, but on his entire people. Mordecai knew this was the greatest test of his life. The Jews of Susa and the entire empire were condemned unless something changed. But what could he do alone? With his face filled with anguish, he ran to the palace. And when he reached the gates, his despair was so evident that the guards, surprised by his lament, allowed him to enter the courtyard. With his clothes torn and his face covered in ashes, Mordecai cried out loudly, not caring about the humiliation. There was no time for dignity, only for action. From inside the palace, Esther watched in astonishment at the scene. She had never seen Mordecai in such a state of distress. He, always a strong and wise man, now appeared vulnerable, her heart filled with fear. She immediately ordered that proper clothing be brought to ease his suffering. But Mordecai rejected any gesture of comfort that did not come with a concrete response. He knew time was running out and that his people were on the brink of destruction. It was at that moment that Esther made a decision that would change the course of history. She sent her servants to approach Mordecai, asking him to explain the situation to her. It was then that Mordecai, with a broken but firm voice, detailed the scope of the decree of extermination. He explained that the entire Jewish people were condemned to die, without exception. However, what weighed most heavily on Mordecai was not his own fate, but the urgent need for Esther to intercede before King Ahasuerus. Although Esther was the queen, Mordecai knew that the palace rules were clear. No one could approach the king without his invitation, not even her. Esther, fearful, responded, "What do you expect me to do? Do you think I can go before the king without being called? That would cost me my life. No one has been summoned to him in 30 days. Her voice trembled with the fear she felt, but also with the anguish over her people's critical situation. Although Esther enjoyed the power and position that many women could only dream of, she knew she was trapped in a rigid system of rules and norms. She could not act lightly, for defying the king without being summoned meant death. Fear overtook her, but at the same time, her love for her people and for Mordecai drove her to do something. Mordecai, with a calmness that only the knowledge of divine providence can grant, responded, "Do not think that, because you are in the palace, you will be the only one to survive. If you do nothing, help will come from another place, but you and your family will perish. Perhaps you have come to royal position for such a time as this." Those words deeply pierced Esther's heart. Mordecai was not only talking to her about the current situation, but he was revealing something much deeper, the reason why she had been placed in that position of power. It was not an accident, it was not by chance. Her ascent to the throne had a divine purpose, a purpose much greater than herself. Esther realized that her dilemma was much more than a personal matter. She had to risk her life and that of her people by defying the laws of the kingdom, or remain on the sidelines and watch her people perish without being able to do anything. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty about what might happen surrounded her, but something inside her began to change. Mordecai's words echoed in her mind, "Perhaps you have come to the royal position for such a time as this." Esther understood that her fate was inextricably linked to that of her people, and that the position she held was not a mere privilege, but a divine opportunity to save lives. The time for action had come, but before acting, Esther decided to turn to what she knew would give her the strength and wisdom she needed: prayer and fasting. For 3 days she and her servants would fast, seeking divine guidance and strength to face the king. "Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me," she ordered. "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I too will fast, and then I will go to the king. If I perish, I perish." Her voice was filled with determination, accepting the magnitude of what she was about to undertake. The fast she called for was a sign of her complete dependence on God. It was an act of faith, an act of total surrender to the divine will. During those 3 days, Esther mentally and spiritually prepared for what was to come. She knew that if she did not act, everything she loved could be destroyed. Her courage did not come from her power or beauty, but from a deep faith that drove her to face death itself for her people. The 3 days of fasting were long and silent. In the palace corridors, the women of the court whispered about the queen's strange behavior. But Esther paid no attention to the rumors or the inquisitive glances. Her mind was focused on the mission ahead, to present herself before King Ahasuerus without being summoned, an action that could very well cost her life. While the king enjoyed his feasts and celebrations, Esther, isolated in her chambers, struggled with her own fears and a growing sense of anguish in her heart. Doubt was inevitable. The risk was enormous, and attempting to approach the king without being called defied any logic in the Persian court. The life of any woman who dared interrupt the royal routine without permission was at stake, and the price in this case was death. Though the king had promised to grant her whatever she asked, even up to half his kingdom, Esther feared not only death but also public humiliation, being rejected or misunderstood. But what Esther did not yet know was that her faith and obedience to God would not only lead her to face those fears, but would set in motion a chain of events that would save her people and change history forever. Esther knew that facing her greatest fear was inevitable, revealing her true identity to the king. Though she wore the crown of queen, her origin was a well-kept secret. She was Jewish, a faith that at that time was despised and looked upon with distrust. If the king were to learn the truth about her origins, everything could collapse. The fear of losing her position, the security the court offered her, troubled her. But even more importantly, she feared that her people, upon discovering her origins, would be even more exposed to danger. Esther wondered if by revealing her identity, she would not only risk her life, but the lives of all those she loved. Fear enveloped her, heavy as a blanket, but something inside her began to stir. Something greater than herself was rising in her heart. She remembered Mordecai's words, "Perhaps you have come to the royal position for such a time as this." Esther understood that her mission was not just to save her life, but the lives of thousands. At that very moment, she was the only one who could act. Her people depended on her courage, and she had to be the instrument God would use to save them. And so, Esther knelt before God in prayer. Humbly, she asked for guidance, strength, and wisdom. She knew she could not depend on her own understanding or strength, but on the divine will. As the fear of death consumed her, something deeper than her fear ignited within her, the determination to do whatever was necessary, to risk her life if needed. Throughout the history of her people, she had always seen God's hand guiding and protecting, and she trusted that that same hand would guide her in this moment. Mordecai, from a distance, was also in prayer and fasting, interceding for her. Their bond of faith, though separated by miles, was stronger than any physical distance. Both knew that their destinies were intertwined in this divine mission. The day finally came, and Esther, with a determined face, dressed in her finest royal clothes. The gold and silk shone in her gown, but none of that mattered. She covered herself with her royal mantle, which symbolized not only her power but also the vulnerability she felt in that moment. With a steady step, she advanced toward the king's hall. As the doors opened, the murmur of the court immediately ceased. All eyes were fixed on the queen, whose presence, though always imposing, was now even more solemn. Esther walked toward the king's throne with a peace that only faith could give. Despite the fixed gaze of the entire court, she walked with confident steps. When King Ahasuerus saw her enter, his face showed a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The tension in the air was palpable, but Esther moved with the grace that only a queen could possess. Though her heart was beating fast, she showed no fear. Ahasuerus, observing carefully, broke the silence with a warm but firm voice. "What is it, Esther? What is your request?" "Up to half of my kingdom will be given to you." The king's words were a relief for Esther, a momentary breath of relief. She had not been rejected, but she knew this was only the first step. The time to reveal the threat had not yet come. Calmly, she responded, "If it seems good to the king, I ask that you come today with Haman to the banquet I have prepared for you." At that moment she said nothing more. She did not mention the decree of extermination nor the threat hanging over her people. She knew every word had to be measured, and each step had to be taken with wisdom. The king, intrigued and pleased by the invitation, accepted immediately. Haman, who was present, suspected nothing and accepted without question. Both King Ahasuerus and Haman were invited to the banquet, unaware that what seemed like a simple feast would be the key to the destiny of the entire Jewish people. Esther's courage, born from prayer, fasting, and unwavering faith, had placed her in a critical position. Though the danger still loomed, she had taken the first step toward her people's salvation. Although the risks remained enormous, Esther trusted that her action was not just for her people, but was part of a divine plan, a plan that, though she did not fully understand, she was willing to follow with faith and obedience. The banquet was prepared, but for Esther, nothing before her was ordinary. The palace servants, under her careful supervision, had set the table with impeccable detail. The air was filled with the aroma of the finest delicacies, while the gleam of gold and jade in the plates reflected the opulence and luxury of the empire. Yet all that splendor was only a backdrop for what was about to happen. This banquet was not a celebration. It was not an ordinary event. It was the crucial setting for an action that could change the destiny of her people. Deep down, Esther knew that what she was about to do went far beyond a feast. As she entered the hall, her gaze stopped on Ahasuerus and Haman, who occupied the seats of honor, surrounded by the nobles and officials of the court. Ahasuerus, accustomed to such invitations, appeared relaxed, almost pleased. Haman, with his arrogant smile, did not suspect for a moment that fate had prepared a trap for him, one he had woven himself. Esther advanced with a steady step, her face serene, but inside the tension was palpable. Every word from Ahasuerus, every gesture from Haman was analyzed, observed with caution. This was not just a banquet, it was an opportunity to lay the truth on the table. But Esther knew she could not rush. Every word, every movement had to be carefully calculated. As the servants served the exquisite dishes and the wine cups were filled, a momentary silence took over the table. Esther remained composed, showing no hint of nervousness. But in her mind, every thought was a calculation. The revelation was near, but not yet. This first banquet was merely an introduction. She knew the time to speak had not come. She could not reveal her cards so quickly. Ahasuerus, enjoying the queen's company and the pleasant atmosphere of the feast, seemed to suspect nothing at all. In a relaxed tone, he said, "What you have prepared is wonderful." And without missing a beat, he added, "What do you wish, my queen? What is your request? Up to half of my kingdom will be given to you." The king's offer was, for Esther, a clear signal. That was the opportunity. But it was not the moment to reveal everything. Despite Ahasuerus' generosity, Esther, with impressive calm, responded, "If it seems good to the king, let this banquet be repeated tomorrow. Only you and Haman accompany me. Then at that time, if it pleases you, I will reveal what my heart holds." Her words echoed in the air like a stone thrown into a lake, creating ripples that only the most attentive could perceive. The request for a second banquet, seemingly unnecessary, was a calculated move. Haman, always so eager for the king's approval, did not hesitate for a second. With a pleased smile, he quickly accepted the invitation. "It will be an honor," he said, unaware that what was truly being prepared was his own downfall. As they continued the banquet, Esther observed every detail carefully. Ahasuerus' calmness, Haman's vanity, all of it served her to weave her next move with cunning. Ahasuerus seemed to enjoy the queen's company and the cheerful atmosphere. But Esther knew that every step she took in that room had a greater repercussion than he could imagine. It was not just a banquet, it was about saving her people, and every second, every word, had to be carefully employed. The court, as always full of intrigue and power games, seemed oblivious to what was truly at stake. Esther, with her poise and subtlety, knew she had placed the first piece in its place. The tension in the air was palpable, and although no one noticed, Esther felt that something was about to change. She had set in motion a series of events that, though invisible to others, were marking the beginning of a revelation that would alter the course of her people's history. When the banquet ended, the three stood up from the table, and the king, with a fresh and confident smile, turned to Esther. "We'll see each other tomorrow, my queen. I look forward to hearing what you have to say." King Ahasuerus, full of confidence, had no idea that this waiting game was, in reality, a masterful tactic by Esther, designed to buy time, to gain power. Esther, for her part, knew she had taken a crucial first step, but the real challenge was still to come. The second banquet was merely the prelude to what would be revealed, the moment when the truth would come to light and the fate of all would change. In the stillness of her chambers, Esther prepared for the final confrontation. She had taken the first step, but much remained to be done. King Ahasuerus had accepted her invitation without hesitation, and Haman, pleased to be favored once more, did not suspect for a moment that his fate had already been sealed. But there was one question still lingering in the air. How would Ahasuerus react when the truth, so carefully guarded, was finally revealed? This moment of suspense was just the beginning of a story that would mark the difference between life and death for thousands of people. The second banquet began with an air thick with tension, although no one yet knew what was about to happen. The hall of the palace of Susa shone with the same magnificence as before, but this time, the atmosphere was different. Esther was determined. Though her heart beat strongly, she knew there was no turning back. This was the moment to reveal the truth, to expose the conspiracy Haman had woven, a threat that could destroy her people. Ahasuerus and Haman arrived on time, enjoying the queen's company and the delicacies served by Esther. But despite the relaxed appearance, Esther felt that the fate of everyone present was about to change forever. As the banquet progressed, the conversation flowed calmly, but Esther kept her eye on Haman, who remained unsuspecting. His arrogance was evident, as though power were on his side, unaware that his downfall had already begun. Finally, after a while of pleasant conversation, the king, with a gleam of impatience in his eyes, turned to Esther, eager to know what she wanted to reveal. "Queen Esther," he said, his voice firm but kind, "whatever you wish to ask, it will be granted to you, up to half of my kingdom, as I promised." Esther, with a serenity she hadn't expected, lightly rose from her seat. She paused, which seemed to last forever, and looked directly into the king's eyes. "If I have found favor in your sight, King Ahasuerus, and if it seems good to the king, allow me to reveal what is in my heart." Her voice was calm, but each word seemed to weigh a ton. The silence that followed was thick, as if the entire court held its breath. All eyes were on Esther, waiting for what would come next. Esther looked at Ahasuerus, then at Haman, and continued, "My request is this, that my life and the life of my people be spared, for we have been condemned to death, to extermination, to be destroyed, annihilated. If we were only slaves, I would endure it, but what they have planned against us is a far greater threat. My people are Jewish, and the person behind this extermination plan is the man sitting here, in front of you, Haman." The revelation was like a lightning bolt that struck the air. Esther's words were not just a revelation, but a devastating accusation that left everyone in the room paralyzed. Haman's face turned pale instantly. His arrogant smile vanished, replaced by an expression of horror and confusion. King Ahasuerus, completely stunned, stood frozen, trying to process the words he had just heard. The atmosphere became charged with unbearable tension, as if time itself had stopped. The king looked at Esther, his eyes reflecting confusion and disbelief. "How is this possible?" the king asked, his voice trembling with incredulity. Haman. Esther's accusation had left Ahasuerus completely disarmed. For a moment he seemed incapable of understanding how his most trusted advisor, the man in whom he had placed all his faith, could have orchestrated such a monstrous plot. Haman, now trapped in the web of his own lies, tried to defend himself, but his words tangled in his throat. "No, it's not as she says, my king. It has no foundation," he stammered, but his words faded as he saw the growing fury in Ahasuerus' eyes. The king, who had blindly trusted him, felt the weight of a betrayal that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. "Did you think you could manipulate me, Haman? You used my trust to condemn an entire people, the Jews who have served in this kingdom, and my own queen who is under my protection," Ahasuerus shouted, his voice filled with rage and disdain. That was the decisive moment. The king no longer saw the man who had been his closest advisor, but a traitor who had orchestrated the death of thousands of innocents. Haman tried to apologize, but his words fell into the void. They no longer held power. The king, blinded by pain and fury, rose from his throne and with a determined gesture, gave an order to his guards. "Take him away," he commanded firmly, and in a swift movement, Haman was arrested and removed from the room. His fate was already sealed. The justice that was coming would be relentless. With Haman out of the room, the king, still in shock, looked at Esther, who stood firm in the gravity of the situation. "What else must be done, Esther? How can I remedy this?" asked Ahasuerus, his face marked by desperation and regret. Esther, feeling the weight of responsibility, approached the king and explained that, although Haman had been arrested, the death edict he had signed was still in effect. The lives of the Jews were still in danger. They still needed to act to reverse the sentence and save their people. Ahasuerus, filled with shame and remorse, promised Esther that everything necessary would be done immediately. He granted her the royal seal so that she could draft a new edict, allowing the Jews to defend themselves and destroy those who sought to kill them. The justice that had just been restored was only the beginning of a radical change in the history of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. Haman, for his part, could not avoid the dramatic turn of his fate. The very trap he had set for the Jews quickly closed in on him. In his desperation, he tried to save his life, but there was no mercy. In light of the magnitude of the betrayal, the king passed sentence. Haman would be executed for his own evil. The execution was swift. The very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai became the place where his life came to an end. Haman, who had been so confident in his power, fell victim to his own wickedness. Thus, Esther's story reached its climax. Evil had been defeated, and the Jewish people had been saved, not only by the bravery of their queen, but also by the act of justice that, though late, was finally carried out by King Ahasuerus. Esther, however, knew the battle was not over. There were still the details of the new law that would allow her people to defend themselves. But the victory over Haman was a crucial step. King Ahasuerus, like all those close to Esther, could only recognize the magnitude of what had happened. The queen, who had initially been silent and fearful, had risen with a bravery that had not only changed the fate of a people, but also transformed the hearts of those around her. After Haman's execution, the situation for the Jewish people in the Persian Empire remained critical. Although the threat of extermination orchestrated by the wicked advisor had been dismantled, the edict he had issued was still in effect. In the Persian kingdom, the law was inflexible. Once a royal edict was issued, it could not be revoked. Despite Haman's downfall, The Jews were still exposed to danger. King Ahasuerus, deeply remorseful for having blindly trusted his advisor, now understood the magnitude of the threat hanging over Esther's people. He knew he had to do something to remedy this situation. Esther, aware that the danger had not disappeared and that her people were still at risk, approached the king once more, with her heart full of gratitude for the support received, but also with deep concern for the future of her people. She requested that the king issue a new decree, allowing the Jews to defend themselves against those who still wished to destroy them. Although Haman had been eliminated, the enemies of the Jews were still scattered throughout the empire. If action was not taken, the danger would continue. King Ahasuerus, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, agreed without hesitation. With the royal seal in hand, he ordered the creation of an edict that not only authorized the Jews to defend themselves, but also granted them the right to attack and destroy those who sought to attack them. The Jews at last became a legitimate force, able to fight for their survival without fear of retaliation from the Persian government. The promulgation of this new decree was much more than an act of justice. It was an act of restoration. The lives of the Jews in the Persian Empire would change forever. They would no longer be a people marked for destruction, but a people who could take control of their destiny. Ahasuerus' edict represented hope, liberation, and a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, courage and faith can open paths to salvation. Esther's transformation was remarkable. From being a young queen living in the shadow of the Persian palace, she became a heroine who saved her people. In a short time, she went from being an ornamental figure to becoming a woman of power, courage, and above all, faith. Her action was not only a personal act of bravery, but one that transformed the fate of an entire nation. Esther had faced death itself, knowing her life was at stake, but also understanding that the fate of her people depended on her intervention. She was no longer just a queen by name. She was a leader who had restored the hope and freedom of the Jews. When the news of the new law spread throughout the empire, the reaction of the Jews was immediate and filled with joy. In every city, in every Jewish community, the news was received with shouts of jubilation, tears of gratitude, and prayers of praise. The Jewish people united in an act of thanksgiving to God for the miraculous intervention that allowed their queen, Esther, to rise in defense of them. They celebrated the courage of Esther and Mordecai, and recognized that all that had happened was not just the work of human wisdom, but of divine providence. The Jews throughout the empire began preparing for the designated day of their defense. Instead of fear, there was now hope. Instead of terror, a firm determination to fight for their lives and freedom. Alliances were formed within the Jewish communities. The men armed themselves with whatever they could find, and prepared to face any aggressor. Meanwhile, Esther, Mordecai, and King Ahasuerus closely monitored the preparations, ensuring that the law was enforced in every corner of the empire. The day set for the execution of the new law was approaching rapidly. The Jews knew it would be a decisive day, a day of struggle for survival, but also a day of hope. However, as the preparations for the defense of the Jewish people advanced, their enemies, those who still harbored hatred in their hearts, did not remain idle. They conspired in secret, determined to stop the growth of the Jewish strength, a force that now seemed a threat to them. But despite the shadows looming over them, the faith of the Jewish people did not waver. The decisive day finally arrived, and what happened in the Persian Empire that day would change history forever. The Jews, armed not only with courage but also with unwavering faith, rose to face their enemies. The battle was fierce, but divine intervention was as evident as the sun in the sky. The Jewish people, guided by Esther's courage and Mordecai's wise leadership, defeated those who had wanted to destroy them. It was a victory over evil, over hatred, and in the end, a victory celebrated with joy in the streets of Susa and other cities. The victory was celebrated as a day of thanksgiving. The Jews gathered in prayers, in songs of praise, acknowledging the hand of God in all that had happened. That day was not just a military triumph. It was, above all, a spiritual triumph. The salvation of the Jews became a testimony that, even when all seems lost, divine justice will always prevail. The event was so significant that from that day on, the holiday of Purim was established, an annual reminder of how God intervened in history to save His people, through the courage of a queen and the unconditional support of her people. The story of Esther is not just a story of bravery, but of unshakable faith and justice. The Jewish people learned in a painful and definitive way that even in the darkest moments, the light of hope can shine brightly. Esther, the queen who had been relegated to a decorative role, became the heroine who changed the fate of her people. She proved that with courage, faith, and determination, there is no obstacle that cannot be overcome. After the victory and the promulgation of the new law that ensured the survival of the Jews, the people of Israel and the Persian Empire began a new era of hope and prosperity. Esther and Mordecai, who had previously been relatively unknown figures in the Persian court, became symbols of courage and hope. However, the path to this consecration as leaders was neither easy nor quick. As history advanced, so did the responsibility that fell on their shoulders. Esther, now more than ever, understood the scope of her role. She was not just a queen, she was the leader who had guided her people through one of the hardest trials in their history. Together with Mordecai, her cousin and protector, she worked tirelessly to ensure the prosperity and safety of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. Both, with unwavering determination, fought to strengthen the position of the Jews, ensuring that they had rights and respect in all the provinces of the empire. Mordecai, with his wisdom and deep knowledge of the court, became a trusted and close advisor to King Ahasuerus, while Esther maintained her influence over him as queen. The relationship between Esther and Ahasuerus, which had initially been marked by distance and fear, began to transform into a closer collaboration. At first, Ahasuerus saw Esther as a decorative figure, whose role was limited to ceremonies and royal duties. But after she intervened to save the Jews, Ahasuerus began to recognize not only her courage, but also her sharp intelligence and her ability to govern with wisdom and compassion. Esther, for her part, understood that, although her love for her people was deep, she also had to be strategic in her relationship with the king to ensure the long-term well-being of the Jews. Over time, the collaboration between Esther and Ahasuerus solidified. Although their relationship was not without challenges, both learned to work together for the good of the Persian nation, but above all, for the prosperity and security of the Jews. Ahasuerus, still surrounded by political and palace intrigues, began to trust Esther's advice and judgments more and more. And Esther, despite her position of power, never lost her humility or her sense of duty toward her people, guiding the empire toward a better future. As the years passed, peace and stability began to take hold in the Persian Empire, largely thanks to the tireless efforts of Esther and Mordecai. The cities, which in earlier times had been scenes of persecution and fear for the Jewish people, were now transforming into refuges of prosperity and peace. The Jews were recognized and respected as a valuable community within the empire, and their rights were protected by law. Esther and Mordecai, as key figures in politics and social life, continued to work diligently for the well-being of their people, ensuring that future generations could live free from the threats that once endangered their existence. In her moments of reflection, Esther often found herself looking back at those days of uncertainty and fear when she had made decisions that changed the fate of her people forever. Now, as a consecrated leader, She thought about the divine providence that had guided her every step in life. Her faith in God had never been stronger, and she understood that her life was not only the result of her actions, but part of a much greater divine plan. In her heart, she knew that her presence in the court was no coincidence, but part of a divine purpose meant to save her people. She reflected on how, through her bravery and faith, she had become the woman she was. At first, she had only been a young Jewish woman with doubts and fears, longing to understand the truth that God offered. But over time, she had discovered in her heart an unshakable love for her people, and an inner strength that pushed her to face the greatest fears of her life. She knew that her role as queen was not a luxury or privilege, but a deep responsibility given by God. As she walked through the palace gardens, surrounded by the luxuries the empire offered her, Esther could not help but wonder why God had placed her there, at that specific moment. Over time, the answer she found was clear. Her life was a testament to the power of faith, and how trust in the divine plan could overcome any challenge, no matter how great. Esther understood that she had been chosen to fulfill a specific purpose, one that went beyond simply being a queen. She was a leader, a protector of her people, a woman who had been called to change the history of her nation. The kingdom of Persia, under the reign of Ahasuerus, prospered during the years of Esther and Mordecai's leadership. Although difficulties and challenges never disappeared completely, the Jewish people, thanks to their bravery and leadership, lived in peace. Esther, the queen who had risked everything for her people, became an eternal heroine, a model of faith, courage, and bravery for future generations. As time passed, Esther saw how her story was told over and over again in every generation of Jews who celebrated the festival of Purim. Her bravery, faith, and love for her people continued to inspire those who faced moments of darkness. Esther became a beacon of light, not only for her people but for the whole world. Her life showed that true leadership is based on faith, justice, and love for others. Thus, Esther's story not only remained in the history books, but also in the hearts of all who trusted that, even in the darkest moments, the light of hope can shine through the courage of a single heart. The story of Esther did not only endure in the pages of ancient texts, but became a living legacy, a testimony that continues to inspire generations. From the moment she raised her voice for her people to her wisdom in confronting power and danger, Esther solidified herself as a model of bravery, faith, and leadership. Her example of determination in the face of adversity, unwavering trust in God, and deep love for her people became a beacon of hope and guidance for all who faced moments of darkness. Esther's impact was profound, not only in her time but throughout the centuries that followed. In biblical history, she is remembered as one of the most heroic figures, a woman whose courage knew no bounds, willing to risk her life for the well-being of her people. Her bravery was demonstrated in the bold decision to present herself before the king without being summoned, as well as in her resolution to reveal the truth about Haman's plot. Esther taught us that true power does not lie only in physical strength or military might, but in wisdom, moral courage, and the ability to make difficult decisions for the common good. Beyond her outer beauty, Esther was a woman who understood that power and privilege are not an end in themselves, but a responsibility. She faced the greatest challenge of her life, knowing that her intervention might be the only opportunity to save her people. And she did it not for her own glory, but for her love of God and her people. Through her story, we learn that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope when we trust in the divine purpose. Esther showed that, although danger may seem insurmountable, faith and trust in God can pave the way to salvation. Esther also showed us that even when we feel small or insecure, God can use us as instruments of change. Her life is a testimony of how faith and courage can transform desperate situations into glorious victories. One of the most significant ways her legacy was perpetuated was through the establishment of the Festival of Purim, a celebration that commemorates the liberation of the Jews from the Persian Empire. Every year, Jews around the world celebrate Purim, remembering how Esther, with God's help, saved her people from destruction. This holiday not only celebrates the military victory, but also the divine intervention, becoming a symbol of hope for all those facing persecution or moments of despair. The festival of Purim is celebrated with joy, feasts, and gifts among friends, offering an opportunity to reflect on the importance of unity, faith, and courage. During Purim, Jews read the book of Esther, known as the Megillah, and recall the lessons this story teaches us, that although God may seem invisible at times, He is always working behind the events of history, guiding those who trust in Him toward salvation. The story of Esther is also a call to action. It invites us not to remain silent when injustice threatens, not to give up in the face of adversity, and to have the courage to defend what is right, even if the personal cost is high. Esther taught us that, by being willing to make difficult decisions and putting others before ourselves, we can be instruments of change, transforming the destiny of many lives. Every time a mother tells the story of Esther to her children, every time Purim is celebrated in Jewish communities, Esther's legacy remains alive. Her life continues to be a source of inspiration for all those who find themselves in the midst of conflict, persecution, or moments of uncertainty. It reminds us that, no matter the size of the threat or danger we face, there is always room for faith, courage, and action. The story of Esther also highlights the importance of community. Mordecai, her faithful support, and the Jewish people as a whole were essential to Esther's victory. No leader, no matter how brave, can accomplish everything alone. Esther understood that the unity of her people and their trust in God were key to their salvation. Therefore, Esther's legacy is not only a lesson in personal bravery, but also a teaching about the importance of unity, trust in the divine purpose, and the power of faith in times of darkness. Today, more than ever, her story continues to resonate, inspiring those who fight for justice, freedom, and peace in a world full of uncertainty. Reflecting on Esther's life, we understand that true leadership does not reside solely in a title or position, but in character. Esther, like other great leaders in history, left an indelible mark on both her people and the world. Her legacy is a clear testimony that when we align with the divine purpose and act with courage and faith, we can change the course of history and transform the future. Esther's story not only defined the fate of her people, but transcended the pages of history to become a living narrative that continues to resonate through the centuries. The impact of her bravery, unshakable faith, and trust in the divine plan was not limited to her time but extended far beyond her reign in the Persian Empire. Throughout the generations, her story has been a beacon of hope, justice, and strength for those facing adversity and fighting for what is right. Esther's bravery, as a young queen willing to risk her life to save her people, has become a symbol of courage that inspires entire generations. Esther, when faced with an imminent threat, could have chosen to stay on the sidelines, protected by her royal status. However, she decided to act, risking her life for the well-being of others. This act of sacrifice resonates through the centuries, teaching us that true greatness is not measured solely by power, but by the willingness to sacrifice for the common good. Today, Esther remains a model for all those facing monumental challenges, reminding them that, although fear may be great, courage has the power to change the course of history. But Esther's story is not just a symbol of bravery, it is also a testimony of justice and faith in divine providence. Despite desperate circumstances, Esther never lost hope or her trust in God. Through prayer, fasting, and brave action, she became an instrument of justice for her people. She showed that, even when everything seems lost, faith in the divine purpose can bring light in the darkness. Esther believed that God had a purpose for her, and through her obedience, the salvation of the Jews was fulfilled. Esther's connection to the divine, her faith that transcends time and circumstances, makes her story even more powerful and relevant to us today. The divine purpose she fulfilled was not only about her personal destiny, but about the fulfillment of Israel's salvation. Esther's intervention in the Persian court was a key moment in the history of the Jewish people. Though God often remained invisible, He used Esther as His instrument to save His people from the threat of destruction. This action of Esther reflects a fundamental principle of biblical history. The salvation of Israel is not a human work, but the fulfillment of a divine purpose. Esther was a crucial part of this great plan. God used this young queen, with her doubts, fears, and courage, to fulfill a purpose much greater than herself. Her story reminds us that, although an individual's vision may be limited in the moment, the story of God's people unfolds across the centuries, always guided by His hand. Esther's bravery and her willingness to risk everything for her people became an essential part of the divine narrative, ensuring the survival and prosperity of Israel. Thus, her story speaks not only of a political or military victory, but of the protection and fulfillment of the divine purpose for Israel. The book of Esther is not only a historical testimony, but a prophetic narrative that shows how God intervenes in human events to fulfill His plan of salvation. Esther's story has transcended eras and cultures, mainly through the festival of Purim, which continues to be celebrated by Jews to this day. Purim is an annual reminder of the victory of faith, justice, and courage over evil. The story of Esther continues to be a source of strength for believers facing persecution or challenges, reminding them that, although circumstances may be dark, there is always hope when we trust in God. Today, Esther's story continues to inspire individuals and communities around the world. It is no longer just celebrated as a historical event or a religious holiday, but as an example of how one person can change the destiny of thousands. Her life teaches us that, regardless of our circumstances, if we trust in God and act with courage, we can make a difference in the world.